There we are, we're recording. All right, well, welcome everyone to a seminar presented by our Emeritus Professor David Bradley. He retired 5 years ago, but the fact that he can give this seminar today, I think, is a real testament to his dedication to language research, documentation, and getting the word out there about a variety of languages. Okay, so David got his undergraduate degree from Columbia University in New York in 1969, David. I'll put it out there.
And don't remind me.
And your PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in 1975. And I believe that was on the language Lisu, David.
Actually, Lahu dialects and comparison of those with other languages.
Got it. Okay, great. And I think he came to Australia soon after, to the Australian University. And eventually ended up at La Trobe in 1982. So I guess that means he was here for over 30 years. And as I said, he's now an emeritus professor, but he holds visiting professor positions all over the world. He's a member of the editorial boards of 8 international journals and monograph series, and he's editor-in-chief of Linguistics of the Tibeto-Burman area, as many of you will know. He's the author, co-author, editor of over 30 books and language atlases, several with translations and or second, third editions. He's got over 200 book chapters and refereed journal articles, over 40 conference keynote papers and over 200 other conference papers, and over 200 seminar presentations at other universities. He's trained over 70 PhD students from 23 countries. And most of these are now training their own students across 5 continents. Not Antarctica yet, David. So his published work is in English, Chinese, Japanese, Burmese, Vietnamese, Tibetan, and Lisu. This gives you an idea that he speaks very many languages. Which is probably a good thing because he's president of the Comité International Permanent des Linguistes from 2013 till, for 10 years. But I mean, the list of languages there, I think, just doesn't do justice to how many languages David can speak. I was surprised one day to overhear him having a perfectly fluent conversation in Italian. Not an Asian language. And I suspect there's many languages that David could have a perfectly fluent conversation in, we'd be surprised. So, all right, I'll hand it over to you, David. We look forward to hearing about Lisu today and Deictics.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I presume you can now see my screen. So I'll be talking about Lisu Deictics, or Deictics if you prefer. And Lisu is, of course, a Tibeto-Burman language, which is in the Southeastern or Burmic subcomponent of Tibeto-Burman and is spoken in 4 countries in China, Southeast, and South Asia. Okay. So I'll be talking about the deictic systems primarily of Lisu, but I'd like to start by comparing this to the deictic systems of a couple of closely related languages to show that Lisu has a number of interesting things not often found in deictic systems, but most of these things are also found in other languages within the same area and in the same genetic subgroup. So some languages have simple deictic systems with just proximal and distal, that's this and that. And these are the languages which have been in most intimate contact with Chinese or other majority languages for a long time. So languages like Kazho, Lipo, Eastern Lisu, and Sami. Some languages have systems in which you have a proximal, medial, distal contrast. Now, this is proximal in the sense of speech act participant by me, medial speech act participant by you, and then distal, neither of the above. So Haniyaka and some other languages have this kind of system. Also Lahu, for example. Then we have languages that have systems based on height. There's been a lot of stuff in the literature recently about the presence of height-based systems in Deixis and other areas of language structure relating to the fact that people live in mountains. Well, these people certainly do. So that does conform to the typological pattern. Lahu, for example, has deictics that show proximal, distal at the same level, distal at a higher level, and distal at a lower level. You may need to close your pictures of each other to see the right side of the screen, I'm afraid. So I'll just do that now. Then there are languages like Burmese, which is the national language of Burma or Myanmar, which has a contrast of proximal and distal, and then an anaphoric deictic, which is something that refers to a noun that has been referred to in the immediately preceding context. So this same kind of deixis.
David, we're still only seeing the very front slide. Is that?
No, that's something wrong.
Something's wrong.
Yeah.
Do we just pause the recording, James, till we sort that out?
You're still seeing.
Yeah, okay, that's all looking better. Hang on. All right. Okay.
So
we can see it now. Good.
Sorry about that. So just to restart, many languages have deictic systems like majority languages, just this and that. Some languages have systems with a proximal by me, medial by you, and distal by others. And other languages, again, have height-based systems where the distance is not just a matter of not here, but also whether it's higher or lower, like Lahu. And then other languages, again, have systems in which there are anaphoric deictics, things which refer to an NP that's in the immediately preceding context. So if we just take Katso as a typical example of the language type that has just a two-way system, Katso has a proximal and distal. As you can see, the forms are te and a. Like many deictic systems in this part of the world, the tones of the different deictics tend to fall into the same category. These numbers here refer to the pitch. The standard way of notating this in East and Southeast Asia is to use the number 5 to refer to a high, the highest pitch within the speaker's range, the number 1 to refer to the lowest. And so 3-3, for example, represents a mid-level tone. 4-4 represents a higher mid-level tone. 5-3 represents a high to mid falling tone, and so on. So in Katso, as in many other languages of this area that have been in close contact with Chinese, they have a system that's been assimilated to the Chinese system, but they still have forms that are cognate with deictic forms in other related languages. They also have structures that are parallel to other related languages. For example, that most of the deictics in most of these languages are bound. That is, they require the presence of something with them in order to make up a full NP. And in this case, for example, the Katso requires some kind of nominal postposition, whether it's a nominalizer like ma, a locative like nya, a manner postposition like ni, or a direction postposition like bi to make a full NP. This is exactly like Lisu in the sense that a Lisu deictic is also bound. It requires something else, although I'll talk about some exceptions later. And as we see, some of the deictics themselves are cognate, and some of the nominal postpositions are also cognate. So these languages are fairly closely related, on the same order of magnitude of time depth, probably as, say, Latin and the Romance languages. So in addition to the two-way system that we see in basic deictics, Katso also has vestiges of a third deictic form, which is O, and it has different tones depending on how far something away is. So in the basic deictic system, that is A. But in the locative forms, you have a form O for something that is visible and there, and something which is invisible and further away, therefore, and also there, is O with a different tone. So tones expressing difference in degree of distance. Another kind of system, Haniyaka, this is a language I'll show you where all these languages are spoken on when I have a map in a moment, that has divergence of about 500 years based on genealogical information. The Aka and Hani are great on genealogies. We took a group of Aka from Thailand to a Hani village in China some years ago. It took them about half an hour to elicit each other's genealogies and work out that there were 23 to 25 generations separated, so about 500 years. Their system is one of these systems where you have a proximal, medial, and distal speaker act participant type system. And again, we can see the forms are cognate. The tones of Hani have all collapsed into one tone category. In Aka, they haven't. So the regularization of tone to all deictics is not universal. It only happens in some languages. Lahu, two varieties. Lahu Nat has a very typical height-based system. This by speaker, that at the same height, that higher, that lower, and that far away, unspecified for relative height. Lahu Shi has the same proximal, the same distal. It has in addition a medial form, that which is by you, yi or e, and then it has not deictic, but locatives. They're higher up and they're lower down, which as we can see are obviously cognate to the distal higher and lower deictics of Lahu Na. But the tones are the same, but the vowels are different. So the vowels of these other deictics, I suspect, have been regularized in by paradigmatic analogy to be similar to those of the basic distal deictic. Then Burmese, an example with an anaphoric deictic. You have two varieties of Burmese. One is the diglossic high, based on the literary language as codified about 800 years ago and first written 910 years ago exactly, in which the proximal deictic is E, and this looks a lot like some of the deictics that we've seen in some of these other languages. And the distal deictic is To, which is similar to the Haniyaka medial deictic and also to the Lisu proximal deictic. So again, we're having paradigmatic change, not just of collapsing tones, but also changing within the system to different meanings within that system. Because now, 900 years later, the spoken form is not E but D, and the written form is, the spoken form is not To but Ho. These are still written this way, but they're pronounced this way. And then in addition, modern Burmese has developed an anaphoric deictic with a prefix E, which gets smuggled back into literary Burmese because some things from spoken do get smuggled back or re-engineered back into diglossic high Burmese. But most of the time, the only one that occurs is the anaphoric edi, which means this one, which we just talked about. Looking at the syntax of these forms, what we see is that there is quite a degree of diversity. In Burmese, the deictic precedes the head. In Katso, Haniyaka, Lahu, and Lisu, the deictic follows the head. In fact, it immediately follows the head. And then various other things follow that. In Katso, you can have a classifier or a numeral in the classifier or a noun postposition and any number of other things, but you must have something, either a classifier or a noun postposition. In Haniyaka, you have the deictic and then a classifier. You must have a classifier if you have a deictic. It's not a well-formed noun phrase if it has just a head noun and a deictic. It has to have a classifier. And you can have a numeral as well. In Lahu, the deictic has to have a V after it. This is a nominalizer. Not cognate to Lisu Ma, but actually structurally in the same slot, and then followed by numeral classifier. There are slight internal dialect differences within Lahu as to how the deictic system works. So I've talked about this. I'll go on and give you a real example from Lisu. The most frequently encountered Lisu deictic pattern is to have a noun head immediately followed by a deictic plus nominalizer ma, or some other one-syllable nominal postposition, or a a deictic plus nominal postposition without a head noun, which we saw on slide 3 with the Katso examples, but just for example, Yido Tuma, news, this nominalizer, this news. I won't talk much about varieties of Lisu, but very briefly, there are about 1 million speakers. They live in 4 countries, 4 varieties that are more or less mutually intelligible, Western varieties, Northern, Central, and Southern along the Salween River, and Weishi along the Mekong or Lansang River in Weishi County are fairly closely related. Then the Eastern varieties, which are spoken in North Central Yunnan and Sichuan, north of the Upper Yangtze or Jinsha River, are much more distinct. The most closely related language is Lipo. Lipo is spoken here, south of the Jinsha River. Weishi Lisu is spoken here in northwest central Yunnan. Northern Lisu is spoken here in northwestern Yunnan, northern Burma, and India. Central Lisu is spoken here in western central Yunnan and nearby in Burma. Southern Lisu is spoken here in various places in Burma and also in Thailand. I said I would mention the places where the other languages are. Katso is here, south of Kunming. Hani is here. Aka is here. Burmese is here on the plains of Burma. And of course, other languages that are related to them are spoken in the intervening areas. Lahu is spoken, for example, here, south of the main central Lisu concentration. There are 4 writing systems. I'll only talk about the one for time reasons. An alphabetic script was devised by a Christian missionary, James Fraser, starting in 1914, and it is widely used, in fact, as an alternative way of speaking Lisu, because, and as I say, I'll skip some of this, the Christian Lisu romanization is based on the central variety of Lisu, that is spoken in Western Central Yunnan, but it's simplified. For example, the deictic system is simplified. The evidential, epistemic, and other systems are simplified. Some things are added to make, for example, abstract nouns, and then lexical material from other varieties, especially the northern variety, is used. But it's not any one person's speech variety. It's another variety of Lisu. And so this additional variety is used by Christians primarily to write and sometimes to speak Lisu in formal contexts. In terms of intelligibility, despite the fact that they are closely related, Eastern Lisu is very difficult for speakers of any other variety to understand. My first encounter with Eastern Lisu was on a train from Chengdu to Xichang in Sichuan in 1988, 8 hours on a train, very bad recording conditions on Chinese trains, I'm afraid, but easy enough to say that this is as close to Lisu as anything could be, but with enough phonological and lexical differences that it's not mutually intelligible. Lipo, completely unintelligible. Weishi is hard. And then even within the Western 3 varieties, it used to be that these people were not in contact for 300 years or so. And so the intelligibility had dropped with lexical and phonological change. But with contact, especially since the 1970s in Thailand, they have become able to understand each other's speech more readily. And just to make it interesting, Book Lisu, this Fraser Lisu written variety with its simplified deictic and other systems, is now an interdialect lingua franca among Christians. So just to give you some deictic forms, Eastern Lisu is like the other languages, Katso, that I've mentioned before, that has only a 2-way system. In this language, the deictic must be followed by a classifier or some other bound nominal, as in most other languages. If we look at the forms, he and go have the same tone. If we look at the Lipo form and the Sani form, obviously cognate to this proximal deictic. However, if we look at the Katso form, they, this is cognate to the Western Lisu proximal deictic. So there's a semantic shift going on between forms within this deictic system, perhaps as a result of the fact that the systems are being collapsed down to be just two-way systems in conformity to the pattern of the majority language. And similarly for Go, Lipo Ku, Haniyaka, and Katso A may be cognate, but quite different. Now, if we look at the main kinds of Lisu that I'm most familiar with, Western Lisu, they have a four-way deictic system, which includes a proximal, a distal same level, a distal higher level, and a distal lower level form. And as you can see, they're all cognate with some phonological changes. So Northern Lisu sometimes uses where other varieties use o in the deictics and other forms. Northern Lisu sometimes uses o, where other dialects use and most dialects use a instead of in the proximal deictic. So four deictics. Just to make it interesting, they also have, for the distal deictics only, three different forms with high tone instead of mid-tone, which express greater distance. So something which is on the same level and far is go. Something that's on the same on a higher level and far is ne, and so forth. The form go is also used to refer to the other side of the river. In this part of the world, the mountains are high, the rivers are in deep canyons, very wide rivers. We're talking about the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Salween, and very hard to cross. So it is really a long way to get to the other side of the river, even though you can see it. In addition, most varieties of Lisu also have a medial deictic, which almost every description of Lisu that you will ever look at has missed, perhaps because they use a template of the language that they're eliciting through. So in Northern Weishi and Central Lisu, you have a medial deictic, but the form of the medial deictic is similar across Northern and Weishi, o or ro, but different in Central with a prefix a, ater, meaning this one, which is next to you, not next to me, and not far away from you. Southern Lisu doesn't have a medial deictic. It doesn't have the o or ro or form at all, and it uses the ate form, its cognate of ater, which is the central form, as not a medial deictic, but an anaphoric deictic. Okay, so the anaphoric deictic system, so we're up to 9 basic deictics plus the medial deictic. Then you have the anaphoric deictics. The Weishi anaphoric deictic is a compound of the medial by you deictic O and the proximal by me deictic T. So this one, which we have just talked about, by you and by me. In the northern and southern varieties, the A forms plus the deictic stem refer to something which is present in the immediate and preceding context. So ate and ago mean this one, which we talked about recently, and that one, which we talked about recently, sorry. And then Lisu in the southern area also has generalized this pattern to have ane and adju for that one higher up, which I just talked about, and that one lower down, which I just talked about. Now, as you can imagine, these are fairly infrequent in texts. The only one that's very frequent in texts is the Southern Lisu proximal anaphoric deictic, but the other forms do occur. Now, so we're up to forms that have bound only status. Now I'm going to talk about a few forms that have isolated only status. All deictics can be followed by the locative postposition qua, which is sometimes shortened. But in addition, it's much more frequent for the combination of a deictic plus a postposition qua locative to be contracted into a single syllable, which has the initial of the deictic, the rhyme of the locative, and the tone of the deictic. So it doesn't have the 4/4 tone of the locative, it has the 3/3 tone of the deictic. It doesn't have the vowel of the deictic, it has the vowel of the locative. Now these deictic contracted locatives are full NPs, they occur as independent NPs, usually alone, and they're very frequent. They make up a very substantial proportion, 25% or so of the deictics that occur in normal narrative, except in Eastern Lisu where they're not attested. Now, I can't guarantee that on the train in 1988, I didn't miss them. So maybe they're there. One should go back and check. So these contracted deictics are locative only. You have a proximal, then the medial and central Lisu ata. Then you have the distal, same level gua, the distal higher level noa, the distal lower level droit or droit, depending on the phonology of the dialect. And notice that the initial has changed to adjust to the fact that this is a back vowel that follows it. It's not the alveopalatal initial, for example, that you see in Central and Southern Lisu in the lower form. It is a retroflex or alveolar. In addition to those various 3/3 tone forms of contracted locative deictics, there are also the expressive high tone contracted locatives, which keep the tone of the deictic 5/5, but get the vowel of the locative and adjust the initial according to the following vowel. Then you can reduplicate. You can reduplicate any deictic whatsoever to express an approximate location with a 3/3 tone on both syllables, to express a very distant location with 5/5 tone on the first syllable and 3/3 tone on the second syllable, and to express an extremely different distant location with 5/5 tone on both syllables. And you can make them also 3 syllables. So they're not very frequent, but the locative contracted deictics are somewhat more frequent. So I'll just talk about the contracted locatives. The approximate ones, gua gua, approximately there. The very far one, qua gua, they're pretty far away. And then extremely far away, qua qua. And notice you can also have the deictic in the first slot instead of the contracted locative, which makes syntactically more sense. But normally it's the contracted locative in both slots, just to make it more interesting. And if you really want to see whether a consultant is on the ball, you can start talking about what other consonants, what other voicing combinations can occur with these very far and extremely far forms. And in fact, all of them can occur. So you can have them completely voiceless, both syllables, initials, with contracted locative or normal deictic. You can have them first syllable voiced and second syllable voiceless, which is the reverse of what the normal would be. Or you can have them both syllables voiced. And in the same way, the extremely far form can also be voiceless in the first and voiced in the second, voiceless in the first, voiced in the first and voiceless in the second, or voiced in both. But the most frequent forms, insofar as any of these is frequent, are the gua gua, qua qua, and qua qua forms. So they also occur for distal higher in the same way, noa noa, noa noa, and noa noa, approximately there up there, very far there up there, and extremely far there up there, and various other dialect forms. And then the distal lower, the same pattern exactly, namely a 3/3 tone, both voiced, a 5/5 3/3 pattern, voiceless voiced, or a 5/5 5/5 pattern, both voiceless initial, or the various other combinations. These are vanishingly infrequent, but you can elicit them, and if you start eliciting them, people will start producing them for you in examples as well. Or if you put them in enough context where they have to talk about things which are of different degrees of being far away or higher up or whatever, then you'll also get them. Then they also occur with 3 syllables, with the various combinations, with 5/5 3/3 3/3 pattern, very far, 5/5 3/3 sorry, that should shoot 555555 there. I'll fix that. Syntax. So, as I say, in principle, these are bound. Very rarely, nothing precedes or follows, and the deictic alone is a full NP. If you're transcribing this with a Lisu person, they will very often want to insert some kind of nominal particle to fix the meaning so that it fits the syntax of Lisu better, but they do occur, very rarely in isolation. But normally, they have something after them. And here's a template of what they have after them. There are some co-occurrence restrictions on the different things in this table. So here's the deictic. It can have a noun before it. It normally has something or other of these things after it. It can have most often a nominalizer, some other nominal postposition that occurs by itself. All of the various kinds of sequences of nouns, any noun phrase in Lisu for that matter, can have a primary or secondary topic, nya or na, on the end of it. And then in addition, there's all kinds of other stuff. Okay, so one kind of stuff is that you can have an abstract nominal suffix that comes immediately on the deictic, sh or g. Another kind of thing is that you can have a dimensional extent nominal like size, quantity, length, height, and so forth. Another thing is that you can have a numeral and classifier. Classifiers are these things that are required with numerals in these languages to make a complete classifier phrase. You can't have a numeral without a classifier. Sometimes a dimensional extent nominal will also have a classifier. Then you have a nominalizer. Then you can have a quantifier, such as adjure all, and then you can have an object marker, or you can have a location, like relative location nominals, tesu, on top, kane, behind, and so on. Then a locative. If you have a locative, you can have an ablative or an allative, and then a topic. Okay, so many co-occurrence restrictions. I won't go into them in detail, but in general, any demonstrative has something after it, except in very rare circumstances in running speech, where the context clearly indicates which of these various things is intended in the meaning. So just to give a long example, the typical examples that you'll find in real language, of course, are not this long, but this is perfectly possible. You can have a noun, ana, dog, then a deictic, go, then a numeral, ku, then a classifier, ma, then a nominalizer, ma, then an object marker, te, and then a topic marker, nya. Ana, goku, mama, tenya. Those 9 dogs who are over there on the same level, not so far, and which are the object and the main topic. Okay, so lots of different combinations can occur. And I couldn't possibly go through all of them in less than 1 hour. So, in addition, I said that you have some imperative demonstrative postpositions. Now you might say, why should there be an imperative on a nominal form? Well, that is because these imperatives are used as discourse markers. So you can take the proximal deictic, te, and put an imperative marker glottal stop on it to give you te, and that is a very frequent discourse marker to attract attention. Look, hey, pay attention now. And then you also have the Southern and Northern Lisu anaphoric deictic ate used as a discourse marker, sentence initial, resumptive, and then, like the extremely widespread and generalizing discourse marker so in English. Go can also be imperativized, and it's also a discourse marker. The higher there above deictic can also be nominalized by a prefix a, and then it means long ago. So something that's high up is long ago. Well, maybe they used to live higher in the mountains. I have a lot of data from texts, but I doubt if I'll be able to go through it in the time that remains to me. I want to leave some time for comments and questions. One interesting thing to note, though, is that in traditional Western songs, in Christian religious materials and translations of texts, And in other things that are in the book language genre, in religious contexts, the deictics are mainly restricted to the proximal and distal, that is, te and go. The expressive forms with 5/5 tone, the duplicated forms, mostly don't occur in these texts. The following data is from the various texts that I have collected or from some published Lisu materials. I'll give you a caveat later about published Lisu materials. So in traditional songs, which have a structure of 7-syllable, 2 pairs of lines, most lines have 4 syllables of nominal material and 3 syllables of verbal material, which of course means that an NP like Anate gu mama tenya is not possible because it has too many syllables. So the forms that are in traditional songs tend to be fairly short. The paired lines have distinct nominal and verbal lexical material, but repeat the same grammatical structure, including deictics. So this is from the first line of the Southern Lisu New Year song, Asher Tule Sit Jango, Amya Tule Nichiango. So Tule, this way. Couple of things to say here. One is that in traditional songs, unlike spoken language, the form te is still used, whereas in spoken language, this is almost universally te rather than te. So traditional songs have an archaic version of the language. If we look at various Southern Lisu songs, we find that the proximal and distal same level deictics are most of the forms, and the contracted locative, meaning here, ta, is only a small proportion. If we look at songs from the more easterly Weishi area, the same song, New Year song, different version, of course, has both the proximal and the distal, but then it also has some of the others. It has the distal higher, distal lower, distal expressive, same level, far away, and distal expressive, lower level, far away, but they're relatively infrequent. If we look instead at some ritual texts by the person who devised his own writing system in the 1920s, these don't have 7-syllable paired lines. They're more or less like chanted rituals that have any length of lines. And in this kind of text, notice the contracted locatives, ta and gua, and for that matter, dra, are quite frequent, whereas the deictics themselves, te, are fairly infrequent. So completely the opposite of the pattern that we saw in Southern Lisu and Weishi Lisu songs. Now, given that Lisu has this simplified book language, the written materials that one finds in Lisu tend to be homogenized into that pattern. So if we look at 3 genres of book-ish material, the New Testament was translated in the 1920s. This is from the 2014 edition. The translation is a text that was written in English about the mission to the Lisu in the 1920s and translated into Lisu by one of my main consultants, a Central Lisu speaker. And the third example is a sermon given by a Northern Lisu pastor to a mainly Northern Lisu congregation. So what we see here is in the Bible, you get almost, well, primarily the 2 normal proximal and distal deictics, the ones that have been selected to be used in this literary variety, and a much smaller proportion of the contracted locative, ta and gua, and none of the others. If we look at the translation, now this consultant, this man is an excellent and very fluent speaker, and so he does use a few of his distal higher and distal lower forms in his translation because, well, it's normal. These people live in the mountains, so things are up there or down there. And in his sermon, the Northern Lisu pastor, again, uses primarily the proximal and distal, but also occasionally the proximal contracted locative, and very infrequently the Northern Lisu form of that higher which is, of course, pretty important in a sermon because you want to make the point that heaven is up there. If we look at translations from Chinese, we see the same pattern, that is exclusively the proximal and distal forms. The Jude text was the first thing to appear published in Lisu in 1959 using the Pinyin Lisu orthography, and it reflects the actual Fugong County Lisu, Te and Ge forms of the proximal and distal, and no contracted locatives. In 1995, a Lisu county governor and party member published a history of the Lisu in Lisu and Chinese, and in that he uses primarily the proximal and distal deictics and a few of the proximal contracted locative. So restricted range in Christian literary materials, restricted range in materials translated from Chinese. Most Lisu texts that have been published are like that. Stuff gets edited to conform to the book language. So speakers often will edit out the deictics that are not present in the book language, the higher and lower and expressives and so on, and replace them with the te and go forms that they like to use in book language. Furthermore, many of the published Lisu texts are transcribed by someone who speaks a different variety of Lisu and may not exactly understand what's going on. So there are problems of that type too, misunderstanding, mistranscription. So I prefer, in what I'm going to talk about from now on, to use texts that I am in control of, that I have recordings of, and that I have transcribed or transcribed with someone. So if we look at these traditional narratives and conversations, we find that the most frequent form is a deictic plus ma. We also get very occasionally deictics without the ma, and then, as I say, speakers like, when they are transcribing them with you, to put the missing nominal postposition in as if it were there. So like a form of editing to eliminate something that they consider to be mildly ungrammatical. So if we look at some Southern Lisu narratives, what we see is that you have quite a range of forms, including many of the forms that are distal higher, distal lower, across different speakers, different types of traditional stories. Lots of the anaphoric ate or ate form. And interestingly, text, the fourth category of text, this is procedural narratives by a Southern Lisu shaman. He is not literate, so he has not been influenced by the literary language, but he does not use these distal higher and lower forms. I have a possible explanation for that. Most of the Lisu shamans in Thailand are the descendants of a grandfather or great-grandfather who was a Chinese Kuomintang soldier who were part of an army that retreated into the eastern Shan state of Burma in 1950, and having no women, married Lisu women. And then those people eventually moved into Thailand. So their descendants have now become so Lisu that they count as Lisu, they reckon themselves to be Lisu, and they act in many cases as the shaman in a Lisu village. So this shaman comes from a family background of speaking Chinese. So he does have the Southern Lisu anaphoric deictic ate, which, as I say, is so frequent in this variety. Now, why does this set of texts not have the ate? Well, I didn't transcribe this. This was transcribed by the same person who translated the book, and I think he took them out. I've talked about this, so we can see, therefore, that the contracted locatives are about nearly about a quarter of the locatives of the deictics, I should say, in the whole text. In fact, in these deictics, the ate forms are mostly the discourse marker, not the anaphoric deictic, but the anaphoric deictic does occur. If we look at Northern Lisu, the same story. In real narrative, you get quite a few of these distal higher, distal lower forms. you also get quite a high frequency of the locative contracted forms ta, gua, no, and ja. In this text, in these 10 stories collected from various people in Fugong County, 1 token of ata, anaphoric, 3 tokens of ago, anaphoric, and 1 token of expressive no, which fills out the gap in the paradigm here. And the contracted locatives are about 1/4 of all the deictic forms. In Central Lisu, 10 stories by 1 speaker, again, a full range of distal higher, distal lower forms, more of the expressive forms, qua, chua, very few of the atur form, which is in this dialect, the medial form. And then also she used some tokens of the reduplicated and triplicated contractive locative. And as we can see, also the anur, anur form long ago. Okay, the final example that I'm going to talk about is Yongsheng, which is the southeastern corner of the Weishi dialect area. Mu and Sun, 2012, transcribed a text from this place. Mu was a speaker of the northern variety of Western Lisu, and he was a skilled linguist, so I believe his transcriptions. And what he says, or what the text shows, is that the proximal is frequent, the distal is frequent, the distal higher is fairly frequent, and the distal lower is fairly infrequent. The medial O is very infrequent, and the anaphoric atur, or in this dialect atur, in Weishi itself it's otur or ote. So interesting thing about this dialect is that the to and the ta forms, which we would expect to be contracted locatives only, in this dialect are also used as deictics. They can be followed by ma or whatever other things you put after a deictic in Lisu. So it looks like the proximal deictic te and the proximal contracted locative ta with an alternative form to have been collapsed in this dialect and are both used for both purposes, both as a deictic in the deictic phrase and also as a locative deictic as an entire NP. So briefly in conclusion, the system is complex. It has in most dialects a proximal, medial, and distal contrast. And within the distal, you have distal same level, higher level, or lower level. You also have anaphoric, proximal, and distals in some varieties. You have expressive distals with voiceless initial and high tone. And then you have reduplicated and triplicated distals with these various tonal patterns, mid plus mid, high plus mid, or high plus high. And so I'd like to then say in Lisu, bomo shamo, meaning thank you. And stop share. Sorry to be so prolix, but I'll be giving this talk as well in a conference in China in a week. So we shall see how that goes.
Great, thank you.